All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the IBS speaker series. We're very excited to have Chinu Parinandi here to give us a presentation on his research. I have a few brief announcements before I pass it off to Professor Krister Anderson to do the introduction. I've got some notes on the screen of how we are running the talk, and if you have any questions, feel free to send me a message. You can use the chat function. If you have a question during the talk, you can raise your hand or send it in the chat and we can address it if it fits. And otherwise we'll have time at the end for other longer times for having question and answer. And finally, I just wanted to read our land acknowledgement. So as we gather, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. And acknowledging that we live in the homelands of Indigenous peoples recognizes the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. With this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples and also recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems Indigenous peoples have developed in relationship to their lands. And so I'm going to pass this off to Krister for the introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen, and hello, everyone. So I'm Krister Anderson. I direct the Center for the Governance of Natural Resources at IBS. And in that capacity, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Chinu Parinandi. Chinu, he's an assistant professor of political science here at CU. He studies the politics of energy policy, mostly at the subnational level here in the United States. And that's what he's going to talk to us about today. He will give us a preview and a bit of a teaser to what is about to come out as a book manuscript with the University of Michigan Press. And the title of the talk and the book is Following in the Footsteps or Marching Alone: How Institutional Differences Influence Renewable Energy Policy. So welcome, Chinu.
Thank you, Krister, and thanks to everyone else for making time to tune in today and watch this talk. I'm going to quickly share my screen and share these slides so you all are able to see them. Okay, this is, as Krister sort of said in a much better way than I'm about to say, this is a presentation of a book that is under contract with the University of Michigan Press. I'm sort of racing to finish the revisions after I promised I'd have it to them earlier. So I'm almost done with the revisions and about to submit this to the press along with reviewers' comments, etc. And the main topic of the presentation is really about renewable energy policy in the US states, kind of as the topical area, if we're going to choose a specific policy. But the substantive area sort of goes much deeper than that. And the substantive area touches upon, I would think, something that is of interest to political science, to economics, to sociology, to individuals that are just interested in natural resources, even if that's not tied to a particular social science track. And hopefully you can see some of that as this talk progresses. So I'm going to start with a motivation. This is a day that happened a couple of months ago, a day that most people like myself were probably glued to the TV wondering sort of how this could happen. Well, maybe some of us political scientists kind of knew it could happen and we were less suspenseful, but most people were sort of glued to the TV wondering how this could happen, thinking that the United States sort of met this criterion that comparative political scientists call consolidated developed democracy. Well, maybe it's not as consolidated as we thought, but the picture sort of gets at this idea that those of us that study American federalism have talked about for a long time in recent decades, which is this idea that the federal government in the United States is increasingly dysfunctional. The federal government sort of finds, Congress, the main lawmaking branch, and the branch that the founders intended to be the primary branch of government, right? This is the first article of the Constitution is given to Congress for a reason. Congress finds it very difficult to pass laws, finds it very difficult to do basic deliberative things. This riot is shown as the first picture on the slideshow because Congress, in concert with the vice president presiding in the previous administration, could not even sort of, or found it very difficult to do something as clerical as certifying a prior election, right? So this is just getting at the idea that at least in the American federal system, the federal government is approaching massive levels of dysfunction. You think of landmark policies in recent history where the federal government has failed to act. It's almost had to default on its debt in terms of passing basic appropriations bills. It has failed to advance and pass immigration reform. It has failed to advance and pass infrastructure bills, et cetera. And this eclipses, not just to pick on the previous administration, this also goes into Democratic administrations as well. There's just a common theme of federal dysfunction. So as political scientists, we might look at this federal dysfunction, and some of us might say, what are the causes? And there's lots of great research that looks at why that's happening at the federal level. But some of us might also look not just at the federal level, but also look deeper or at a more local level in American politics and say, okay, if the federal government is so dysfunctional, and if we have all of these huge challenges that demand a policy response, is there some other venue that we can turn to that might sort of allow us to tackle these problems, even in the presence of federal dysfunction? And that gets to our theme of federalism. Now, this individual is a famous Supreme Court justice, Justice Louis Brandeis. There's a famous university where I sort of stole this picture, although I attributed the picture to them. There's this famous university that's obviously named after him on the outskirts of Boston. But Brandeis was really this extremely sort of an intellect Supreme Court justice, if you could imagine that, right? An intellectual force of nature. And Brandeis focused on a lot of his jurisprudence on sort of policy implications of the law. And he was the author of a very famous dissenting opinion that usually gets forgotten, but a dissenting opinion in this 1932 Supreme Court case called New State Ice Company versus Liebman. And in this dissenting opinion, he made this comment that's sort of been recycled in the nearly 100 years, right? We're approaching the 90th anniversary of this case. But in the time that's passed since then, he said, it's one of the happy incidents of the federal system that a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. Now, the idea here that's sort of, like I said, been recycled again and again by people on all ends of the political spectrum to uphold one of the core tenets of American federalism is that federalism allows for, and I should be specific, the policy autonomy and decentralization inherent in federalism. So it's not sort of it's not something that just exists in federalism. It's something that has to be activated, sort of a culture of decentralization and autonomy that's upheld by political safeguards of the individual states. But what happens with federalism is that you have 50 different states in the United States, for example. Those 50 different states have some level of protection and safeguard from federal activity, and they're able to, if their citizens desire, as Brandeis would say, adopt whatever policies they want. They can try sort of things that have never been tried before anywhere else in the country. And the fruits of that experimentation, some of the fruits will serve as templates that might spread elsewhere, right? So instead of like, and you can imagine a country like the old Soviet Union, right? Where you may have innovation, but the innovation is sort of top down in nature. That innovation is dictated by Moscow, and there may be sort of one kind of innovation that can happen across the entire geographical breadth. One of the supposed strengths of federalism combined with democracy is that you have 50 sort of areas where innovation can happen. Some of it's going to fail, some of it's going to succeed, and then that's sort of a good for the entire union. And actually, American political history is full of examples of policies that began as state experiments that then spread and went nationwide. One such thing would be sort of the 20th Amendment, when women obtained suffrage. This began as something that occurred in Western territories and then sort of spread to other states. Gay marriage is something else that fits this bill. Air pollution legislation began in Oregon in the 1950s and then went nationwide. So there are lots and lots of examples of this kind of activity occurring. Now, I'm interested in the particular issue of renewable energy lawmaking, and specifically about Brandeis's comment with respect to renewable legislation and rulemaking, and with respect to actually interrogating whether the states are creating sort of novel policy. And renewable energy, at least in the electricity sector, because I know there are different sectors, right? The federal government has much more involvement in transportation related fuels, but in the electricity sector, which is still sort of a sector where the majority of our coal is consumed and where lots of our fossil fuels are used, in the electricity sector, the federal government has been entirely absent. They've sort of passed the baton on to the states. And this is a problem because the electricity sector is a major source of carbon emissions in the United States. So if you think about the federal government not solving a problem that is sort of a major problem that's going to not only impact our lives, but impact the lives of our children, impact the lives of their children, et cetera, it's really incumbent upon us to explore what the states are doing and whether the states are actually creating sort of untested, novel policy, pushing sort of the policy frontier forward, so that some of those policies can then diffuse to other states. And if that's the case, what are the ways in which the states are doing this? What are the conditions under which states are doing this? And how might different institutional parameters or institutional foci with which the states have sort of advanced policy, right? Like, can we say that state legislatures are inventing in a particular way, but regulatory commissions are inventing in a different way? And so how might that institutional environment affect sort of novel policy development in renewable energy? And so my question sort of is looking at the sources of invention or novel policymaking in the area of renewable energy or renewable portfolio standards. Now, this question is tied to a much richer political science literature that's mainly focused in American politics, but also bridges to the other sort of famous subfields in political science, like comparative politics and IR and even political theory. Now, for over 5 decades, starting with a paper written in 1969 in the American Political Science Review by the late Jack Walker, there's been this real focus on what's called innovation. And innovation is different from what I call invention. I don't want this talk to sort of be a talk where we're lost in terminology, so I'm going to gloss over it now. But basically, this literature in political science has really looked at this idea that the states are going to adopt policies that are new to them. No distinction is made about whether those policies are new across the system of states, but a rich literature looks at states just adopting policies that are new to them. Now, that literature became a literature on policy diffusion, which is when policies spread across states, right? So in political science, there's been famous studies that look at the diffusion of lotteries or the diffusion of like Clean Air Acts and the diffusion of other sorts of things. In IR or international relations, we might talk about the diffusion of liberalism across countries, right? So the political science literature is really focused on diffusion, but not that original thing that Brandeis was talking about, which is the creation of novel policy. Not when a state adopts a policy that's new to it, regardless of whether it's new anywhere else, but when a state adopts a policy that's not only new to it, but also new across the system of states. And we might think that sort of this is a riskier proposition, or at least a more unknown proposition than just adopting a policy that's new to you, right? So like I can use the example of Everett Rogers' famous S-curve when it comes to the adoption or the diffusion of innovations in technology, right? So somewhere with like adopting a smartphone, the first smartphone came out in 2009, 2010. I'm sort of a middle adopter. So I adopted a smartphone maybe in like 2014, I think. Now, my mom is a late adopter, and so she adopted a smartphone in 2018. Now, it probably doesn't matter if the smartphone's new to the person adopting it, if you're at the tail end of that system of adoptions, at the tail end of the S curve. But what really might be interesting is to just look at why someone would sort of be at the very beginning, and not just sort of at the very beginning for one particular adoption, but at the very beginning for a whole class of adoptions related to a policy. So the question is, when do the states adopt novel policy? And I focus specifically on renewable energy portfolio adoption, looking between the years 1983 and 2011. So very briefly, a renewable portfolio standard is and I think most of you are familiar with what this is, but I'll cover it very briefly. It's a policy where a state, most of the time, but not always, a state requires that retail electricity providers in that state are going to procure some amount of electricity from renewable sources. Now, this is a state level policy. It's not a federal level policy. So it's not governed by the Federal Energy Regulatory, it's not governed by FERC. It's governed by state public utilities commissions. The only state in the entire country where the same public utilities commission would govern wholesale and retail would be Texas, which is obviously in the news recently for this very reason. But this is a policy that's meant to sort of spur renewable energy development and use that's mainly and overwhelmingly occurred at the state level and has not occurred at the federal level. So we can talk more about the RPS space just because it's important to talk about this before I get into sort of how I define and operationalize invention, and then how I do sort of theory testing. Now with the RPS policy space, a majority of states in the years since 1983 have adopted RPS programs. 1983 is a good starting date because this is when Iowa was the first state to adopt like a proto RPS program. It was called the Alternative Energy Act. The Iowa Act really hasn't changed over time, but the idea that policy can be marshaled in this kind of way has disseminated across the states to the point where the vast majority of states, I think last time I checked, it was about 35 states, somewhere around that ballpark, have adopted RPS programs that either allow for mandatory requirements or like a voluntary requirement or voluntary offer, not a requirement, that allows utilities to generate more renewable energy. Now, the vast majority of these RPS programs have been adopted legislatively. So the legislatures have really taken the lion's share of adoptions by using their lawmaking statutory authority. But many renewable portfolio standard policy sort of features have been adopted through PUC rulemaking. And this is really great because it allows us to see how bureaucratic or regulatory agencies are also involved in adoption. Now, this goes back to sort of the American politics diffusion literature. That literature is like obsessed with legislative politics. And part of the reason is that laws in the era before the internet, laws were much easier to gather and much easier to trace than sort of regulatory rulemaking. But that doesn't sort of take away the fact that regulatory agencies play a huge role in policy adoption. A famous study in 2018 by two political scientists showed that in the years between 1990 and 2010, there were 400,000 regulatory rules passed across the states. So we can't ignore the idea that these actors can also play a role in inventing new policy in the way that Brandeis would talk about. And so it's very important to also look at the conditions under which they might do so if we're also looking at legislatures. So a major part of this study looks at identifying invention. So what is invention? If we're going to take Brandeis's phrase seriously, and we're going to move that phrase to the point where we can operationalize it, test it using the tools that political scientists use, mainly statistical analysis, but also qualitative analysis, for those of you that might be inclined to do so. If we're going to sort of develop explanations that talk about invention, we need to identify it first. And so one really important idea here that I do in response to the political science literature is I focus on the sub-policy rather than the policy as the analytical unit that I am studying. So if you look at 50 plus years of political science research, there's a real emphasis on looking at the policy writ large. So I'm not going to look, I'm just going to get out of form for a second and talk about what that means. I'm not going to look at renewable or pieces of renewable portfolio standards. I'm just going to say, did Colorado adopt an RPS? Yes, no. Did Utah adopt an RPS? Or did Wyoming adopt a lottery? Did Nebraska adopt a lottery, if that's your area? So you assume that all of those policies are created equal across the states. You assume that the content of those policies is equal. And then you say, did that large policy spread across the states? Now that's useful in order to say, or in order to analyze if like a meta policy adopted across a group of actors. It's not useful if you're interested in looking at Brandeis's idea of novel policy. And the reason that it's not useful is that the devil is really in the details here, right? The proof is not going to be observable at the level of an RPS writ large. Like, did you or did you not adopt an RPS? The proof is going to be available in the content of the policy itself. So if you want to detect invention, if you want to detect novel experimentation, you have to drill down and go deeper. And so what that basically means is focusing on the sub-policy, finding out what those major and in many cases non-major sub-policies are, identifying a universe of sub-policies, identifying whether that universe of sub-policies meets this classification of invention, and then using the tools within political science to analyze that behavior. Now, another aspect here that pushes back on that paper by Walker that I talked about is choosing a time rather than unit-based definition of invention. So the idea here is that Walker used the definition of innovation is what he called it, and a lot of the political scientists called it, where I innovate if I adopt a policy that's new to me, regardless of if it's new across the system. Well, if we're going to analyze Brandeis's quote, we can't use that definition because Brandeis's quote is a quote that depends on tracing observations and actions across the system of states. So instead of using that quote, we're going to use a definite, or instead of using the unit-based definition, we're going to use a time-based definition. Basically, a sub-policy adoption is an invention. It's novel policy. If a state adopts that sub-policy before any other state has done so, or by the next year after the first state's adoption. Now, you're going to be asking me questions, and I'm going to preempt them by giving you some qualifications for what this definition means. The first qualification is that I bound my attention on the system of states. It is true that a state might sort of be the first to adopt a policy feature or a sub-policy when that sub-policy has already been adopted in Uruguay, right? So Uruguay did marijuana legalization around the same time as Colorado. And so there might be this argument that, well, Colorado did not actually adopt novel policy. Colorado copied from Uruguay. Well, that's always true in the extreme, but sort of I'm interested in looking at states that I think are comparable by virtue of having similar institutional choices, similar demands, similar historical structures, et cetera. So I'm interested in sort of a bounded diffusion or a bounded policy-making process that occurs within the 50 states. Now, if places like Uruguay played a role, they may have. Unfortunately, I don't factor that in here. It's not a global study of invention. Now, the other issue is why it might be apparent, and obviously probably is apparent to you, why it's invention if a state is the first of any state to adopt a sub-policy. It may not be apparent to you why I say, or by the next year after a state's adoption. This is just the idea that two states can simultaneously try to invent a policy in the same way that Newton and Leibniz tried to, or Leibniz, I don't know how to pronounce his name, tried to create sort of calculus. And so two states might sort of be in the race with each other, or they might coincidentally adopt a couple of months after each other, and you can't claim that one is copying the other. And so instead, to account for that possibility that there might be sort of coincidental or near simultaneous invention, I build this grace period in the definition of invention. So in order to identify invention, what I do is I gathered 280 lawmaking and rulemaking documents across all of the states that adopted and amended their renewable portfolio standards between that 1983 to 2011 period. I identify the adoptions of sub-policies, and then I code those adoptions as invention based on whether they meet this definition that's in this bullet point here. And that allows me to sort of identify a corpus of sub-policies that meet what we would imagine to be Brandeis's idea of novel adoption, sort of risky, untested adoption. Then with that corpus of inventions, you can use pooled event history analysis, which is an increasingly common methodological tool employed in political science. Some papers that use it are Bemke in 2009. Bemke actually has written several papers where he advocates the use of this method. Graham Boucher, I have a 2020 AJPS where I do this. So pooled event history analysis, basically what you do is you take all of the policy features that make up sort of a meta policy, and instead of analyzing each of those policy features separately, you pool them together. And obviously this might create issues of standard error, you may have to adjust your standard errors, you may have to adjust sort of on the deterministic side of the regression, you may have to adjust sort of the fraction of prior inventions that have occurred in the state. I do all of that, but this is a really useful way to analyze large sets of data that are distinct from each other, but are related within the same sort of meta policy. Now with pooled event history analysis, risk or the opportunity to experience an event, to use the language of event history analysis, starts for experiencing any invention in the data set in 1983. Now, I chose 1983 because of pushback from reviewers. Really, when you're using this particular method in your own research, it's up to you sort of, we tell our students that theory always trumps data. It's really up to you to sort of figure out when a new technology or when a policy is actually possible in your data. And that when that policy is possible or that new technology is possible, then that's sort of what is going to predetermine the left censoring in your data. And so, yes, a state, so yes, I couldn't come up with an argument for how this technology for these policies did not exist after 1983. And so I chose 1983. But if I had better data on when these technologies that make up different RPS sub-policies were invented that were later, then you would structure the data set in a way that it would not all start at 1983. Now, a state can no longer invent once it has, or when 2 years have passed since the year in which the first state adopted the same sub-policy. And that's to reflect this idea that there's a grace period in invention. Now, all adoptions that don't meet this criterion are what I call borrowing. And they're all adoptions that occur at least 2 years after the year in which the first state adopted a sub-policy. That's called borrowing. Now, borrowing is useful in that it can be used as a placebo so first you conduct a regression on sort of what determines or what explains invention. And then you say, well, is this unique to invention or does it also explain other types of adoption? And so borrowing, which is the other part of Brandeis's comment, right? The states that are free riding and observing the experimentation of the novel policymakers, borrowing is a useful placebo to test explanations for invention. So what I do, without getting too far into the details, which I feel like I already have, master risk sets for invention and borrowing are created, and then adoptions and non-adoptions that make up those master risk sets are can be separated by institutional source to conduct institutional specific analyses of invention. What that basically means is you make a master risk set that applies to any institutional actor. So like when a state invents, that state's ability to invent drops out of the risk set. So the next period, they can't do anything. Then if you want to analyze legislatures, you take those non-adoptions and the legislative adoptions, and then you analyze legislative behavior. And if you wanted to analyze Public Utilities Commission behavior, you take non-adoptions and then you take Public Utilities Commission adoptions and then analyze Public Utilities Commission behavior. So with all of that said, I'm already going to run over time because I was told 40 minutes. What are the determinants of legislative invention? So one of the major findings that I show here that gets really into some of the formal theoretic work on invention that's been shown by people like Bolden, Ting, and Carpenter in a 2008 formal model in the APSR, and then also in Steve Callender's work on sort of like finding policy solutions across social systems, is that ideological liberalism largely explains invention in renewable portfolio policy making. Now, what I mean here by ideological liberalism is I use methods of measuring the ideological makeup of legislatures that exist within political science and specifically within American politics. And I find that the more liberal a legislature is in its ideological orientation, the more it's going to adopt novel, untested RPS policy. Now, there are a couple of reasons why this might be the case. The reasons that I sort of that I choose and that I emphasize are, first, there's this idea that liberal legislators or more liberal legislatures, they're more fully embedded in networks where these policy ideas might sort of be flowing around, right? So if you think about interest group related theories of policymaking, the more ideologically extreme you are, and here with RPS, we're looking at the liberal side because regulating to create greater investment in renewable energy is much more firmly within the liberal nexus in American politics. But the idea basically is that the more liberal you are as a lawmaker, the more embedded you are in these networks. So these ideas might sort of not only be ones that you are exposed to, but they also might be ones that you think are more sort of worth adopting. Now, that second point is also important. At some point, as your ideology becomes more liberal, you believe that the policy is worth adopting in spite of a lack of evidence. And so one of the ideas about invention and one of the ideas about Brandeis's concept of novel policy adoption is that you're taking a risk. He says in his comment, a courageous state, right? There's this idea that you're sort of shooting into the unknown, so to speak. That requires some type of belief that what you're doing is right, or at least some type of belief that you don't care about being wrong, which also kind of is the other way of looking at the same coin, that you think that you're right and that what you're doing is the right thing to do. And I would argue that at least in a liberal area like RPS adoption, the more liberal you are, the more likely you will believe that sort of that is the right choice, and you will not find it troubling that there really isn't a template that exists of another state having tested this policy. Now, liberal ideology, if we believe that there's a qualitative difference between invention and borrowing, where borrowing is a bunch of free riders that have observed other states and then are choosing what to do based on sort of the experimental results of those other states, then liberal ideology may actually have less resonance in explaining borrowing. And the reason is that there are going to be some states, and this isn't to say that borrowing is not increased by liberal ideology. We're still borrowing the same set of renewable portfolio policies. So yes, borrowing should be influenced in a positive direction by greater legislative liberalism. But what's going on here is, in that group of states that are borrowing, there are going to be a greater heterogeneity ideologically of lawmakers. So what that basically means is that there are going to be more lawmakers that are adopting it, not because they're sort of ideological bedfellows with the policy per se, but they're going to adopt it because they have observed it and they're making this pragmatic decision that's separate from their ideology. And that's going to reduce the relationship between borrowing and liberal ideology. And so this is sort of results from this analysis with some variables. The main variable here is legislative ideology, which is as legislative ideology increases based on the scale by Berry et al., that means there's a more liberal legislature. So what we find, or what I find, sorry, is that liberal ideology or legislature becomes more liberal in nature, and the probability of inventing or adopting novel, untested RPS policy increases at a standard 0.05 threshold of critical value. Now with borrowing, there is a positive relationship, and there should be, right? Because you're still adopting the same set of policies, but it's not as strong. And that leads some sort of semblance of, leads some evidence or some credibility to what I've said as to why there should be a difference in terms of how liberal ideology relates to inventing versus borrowing. Now I have a bunch of other controls thrown in. I'm already running out of time, so I'm going to breeze through and I can talk about these in a Q&A. But basically one thing to take away here is that this is an extremely kind of like observation heavy, labor heavy kind of process that probably will limit its external use, I'm sure. But there are 230,000 observations in the invention data. A lot of those observations are driven by sparsity, right? Because states get the opportunity to invent, and then they don't necessarily invent, but capturing at the sub-policy level, the amount of granularity and then operationalizing it in an event history model is something that is very useful, but also extremely labor intensive. Now we're gonna move from there and we'll return to legislative invention in a second when I've gone over time. But we're gonna move here to talk very briefly about regulatory invention. So what I find when I look at Public Utilities Commission inventing is that sectoral deregulation actually is what might increase a PUC inventing novel RPS policy. And this might seem weird, but if you dig into the regulation and deregulation literature, one thing that comes up is that deregulation was couched as something that obviously, like, quote unquote, put electricity in the hands of the consumer, or to put my own prejudices back in, made the consumer incredibly powerless when there were cold weather issues in the Texas grid. But deregulation doesn't just sort of theoretically give consumers choice. What it also did was it broke up well-established, vertically integrated monopolies that existed in states that were regulated. So what basically happened with deregulation is that electric utility companies controlled both the generation as well as the distribution of electricity, right? So when you flip your lights, Colorado is still regulated, but when you flip your light switch on, right, Xcel Energy controls both the generation / procurement of the energy that makes up the light that you're flipping on, as well as the distribution of that electricity to you. What happened with deregulation was that the generation procurement side was broken up, right? That is where entry for new entrants was allowed. Now, those old monopolies, the Xcels of the world in Texas, or the Xcels of the world in New York, like Consolidated Edison in New York, American Electric Power in Ohio, these old large companies that formerly had vertically integrated monopolies, they lost the generation side of things, but held on to the distribution side. Now, what I argue happened in this case was there was a short window that occurred shortly after deregulation where the companies were scared because their monopolies were broken, and they were more compliant with what regulators wanted them to do because they recognized that regulators had power to sort of also try to hurt their distribution related monopolies that they still possess. And issues like distributed generation or local level sort of distribution that cuts out the utility provider, these are very salient things in the energy industry or the electricity industry, and things that utility companies are scared of. And so lots of these entrenched utilities that held on to their distribution monopolies were more pliant because they wanted the regulators to support them in case other challenges to their sort of market position would emerge in the future. And so what this basically means is that public utilities commissions knew this, and upon deregulation, they found it sort of in the short term easier to pass renewable portfolio standards inventions. And what you see here, and again, I show selected variables, but you see a positive relationship between deregulation. You don't see it with borrowing. One reason I think you don't see it with borrowing is that borrowing, again, is a known entity, right? So electric utility companies may also not like borrowing, but they have templates. And actually, if you look at the business, I looked at a bunch of business literature surveys for this book. you look at the business literature, what a lot of firms tell you is they don't mind regulation per se. They hate uncertainty. And invention in many respects is a form of uncertainty, because invention is really taking a step into the unknown and adopting a novel policy. So from that perspective, it makes sense that they may not be as annoyed by borrowing, but they're really annoyed by invention. Now, what's also interesting is there's this other feature in the regulatory landscape where some public utilities commissions have elected office members and the vast majority have appointed office members. Election of regulators makes them more like legislators, which makes sense in a way, but it makes them more, I think, more interested if there is a public demand to do so, more interested to take on utility providers and adopt renewable portfolio standards. And I say adopt in the case of elected because there's a positive association with respect to novel policy and a positive association with respect to borrowing. Now, what's going on in the state of Arizona today, because I have a qualitative chapter I won't really get a chance to discuss, is that in Arizona, public demand has actually been in favor of renewables, and the elected PUC in that state has sort of tried to harness that public opinion and adopt a bunch of renewable standards. The major regulated utility company there, it's not a deregulated state, which is funnily called the Arizona Public Service Corporation, even though it's an investor-owned utility company. It is mounting an effort to get Arizona's Public Utilities Commission to be appointed rather than elected. And so what they're doing is they're going to the legislature and saying, look at these unelected, or not unelected, look at these wannabe legislators who are not acting like regulators. You need to control them and appoint them so that we can get policies that are going to benefit us as a firm. So what about, and one last thing I want to talk about, this pushes away from renewables, but what about the conservative direction? So reviewers of the book have asked me to not just look at RPS, but also look at if that legislative finding pertains in the conservative direction, right? So RPS is liberal leaning. Is it just the case that liberals like to adopt more policy, right? There are longstanding surveys that demonstrate that liberals have more faith in government. They have more faith in the powers of government to sort of solve problems, and in the position of government to sort of devise policies that are explicitly aimed to solve problems. So what happens on the conservative side? What I did was I gathered a huge data set from two authors of anti-abortion policy adoption from a paper that was published in 2016. I recoded that based on my classification that I offer here of invention versus borrowing. And I re-estimated adding government ideology to their particular study. And what I find when this is done is that government ideology has the same relationship for conservatives, but here it would have it in the opposite direction because the scale goes left to right. So the leftmost is conservative and the rightmost is liberal, but it's the same relationship. So those true believers in conservative policy are the ones that are going to adopt anti-abortion policy in spite of any evidence, in spite of the lack of templates, right? They're sort of the ideologue true believers that are adopting this policy. And then there's going to be a more ideologically heterogeneous borrower group that also is going to skew conservative because there's a negative association for borrowing, but it's going to be more diverse. And so borrowing does capture a greater group of actors across the breadth of the states. Now, what does all of this mean? There are lots of implications. I have a whole chapter in my book about implications. One is that in liberal and conservative policy areas, novel adoption is driven by ideologues. This is both good and bad. If you, and it's really based on where you lie on the spectrum as sort of, public citizen. If you think that liberal policies are good, then liberal ideologues are good for you because they're going to push the policy envelope in an untested direction. If you think conservative policies are good, then you're going to want conservative ideologues because they're going to push policy in an untested conservative direction. However, if you want policy to sort of be moderate, this may not be good for you because it's not sort of the consensus-based idea of how we're taught to believe politics should emanate. Now, one question I don't answer in the book is whether this pattern transfers to sort of ideological moderates in quote unquote moderate areas. I'm not really able to answer this. I'm hoping to answer it in another paper, but we don't even know what a moderate policy is. The field of state politics has not decided this. And I think in today's era where everything is polarized, right? Who would have thought a year ago that something as potentially harmless as the idea of wearing a mask would become polarizing? And so it's hard to figure out sort of what a moderate area is to do this analysis. Even more so, if we figure out what a moderate area is, are unidimensional ways that we measure ideology and state politics might create problems. They might create no association with respect to a moderate policy. So it may be the case that the only places in the political spectrum where we can figure out that ideology is driving invention is at the extremes. And that just might be a bug or a feature of our political system. Now, another sort of implication is that we really shouldn't look to regulatory bodies to act as a substitute for legislative action on renewable energy. There's this constant fear that legislatures are not enough. There's this constant fear that legislatures kind of like, they do what voters want or what they think voters want or what they think extreme voters want. And it's really the technocratic elites that are going to save us. If you view PUCs as technocratic elites, and there are lots of reasons not to view them as that, but if you view them as more technocratic in nature than legislatures, that's not the answer. The salvation in renewable energy does not lie in letting regulatory bodies act because of what regulatory capture, I'm trying to think of the paper, George Stigler, these famous papers on regulatory capture in the 1970s. Those papers tell us, right, that the electric utility company is paying a lot more attention to the regulatory commission than you are. And so they're going to extract concessions that you may not be able to extract. And so legislatures may not be perfect, but they may be the best that we have. And then also one way to tie electoral dynamics to RPS invention, and I didn't have enough time to talk about the electoral results, might be to cultivate the idea that RPS is a moral policy. So with the anti-abortion results, what I find is that electorally vulnerable legislatures are more likely to invent, whereas with RPS, they're more likely to borrow. One of the reasons I think they're more likely to invent in anti-abortion policy is that anti-abortion policy is a policy that elicits much stronger sorts of opinions of good and evil amongst supporters and opponents than RPS is, if you look at public opinion data. And so what that basically means is that those lawmakers that want to attract abortion opponents are trying to sell this as like, you need to adopt the untested thing because that's pushing us along this dimension in the fight of good versus evil, basically, to use that phraseology. Whereas with RPS, where you have a more broad-based group of supporters, you can appeal to some people who like RPS in that way, but not everyone. So if you want to tie RPS to electoral dynamics, one way might be to sort of make it much more of a moral issue. And I think a lot of the interest groups and people that are pushing for climate change action, they understand this. And that's why they're tying climate change to kind of an imperative issue that adopts sort of like this, we must do it now moral idea. And then future work. I mentioned one type of future work. Couple of things I'd like to do after this book is in print. One is replicating the analysis using a massive 50-state, 200-year data set that was released by a bunch of political science authors called SPID. That would require identifying like what government institutions adopted laws over a 200-year span and sort of using our ideological measures to see if this breaks down across a huge breadth of data. Another would be using projected federal intervention to study how federal influence impacts state invention, right? So the motive of the book was really looking at when the federal government is not active. But what happens if, for example, in the next 2 years, there is some semblance of the Clean Power Plan that's passed into law? What does that do to the states? What does that do to the state's own invention patterns? What does that do to their borrowing patterns? So that'd be a fascinating topic for future work. And then also finally, I wasn't able to do this here, conducting regulatory analysis on a conservative policy area. So how do public utilities commissions behave when the area where invention is occurring is not RPS, but sort of fracking allowances? And that's it. And I'm happy to yield the floor to any questions.
Thank you, Chinu. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question, if I can just jump in.
Definitely.
Thanks, Tinu. So, I'm just curious, it's sort of a methodological question, how you distinguish between borrowing and inventing. I imagine that when you get into the weeds of sub-policy, I guess the question is, how unique does that sub-policy have to be in order for you to code it as invention rather than a copy of somebody else's? Like if Colorado took Kansas's RPS, whatever the thing and they tweaked a few numbers or the process, was that ever an issue when you were coding these cases, or how did you deal with that?
That's a great question. I have two answers for you. The first answer is that so the way I code borrowing is if some other state has adopted this. So like, let me use an example of coal being considered a renewable portfolio, like an eligible source for a renewable portfolio standard. If Colorado is the first state to adopt coal and consider it to be an eligible resource, then Colorado is clearly inventing. Now, if some other state does this after, considers coal to be an eligible resource, and does this 2 years after Colorado has done it, that state would borrow. It doesn't matter if there are only 2 states. It doesn't matter if there are only 37 states. So I don't weight borrowing in terms of how many are borrowing. And that might be a design flaw, but I was more interested in terms of looking at sort of just whether copycat, or I don't want to use copycatting, whether observation is occurring, regardless of how much that observation is occurring. Now, to get to your second question, I've been studying diffusion for a long time now, and I've always flirted with this idea in terms of looking at anti-plagiarism software or cosine similarity scores. And I think those are very useful for a certain type of diffusion that's pushed by ALEC and that's pushed by other kinds of interest groups, like the classic model legislation kind of bills. The issue that I have with that with respect to this policy area is many of these RPSs predate ALEC pushing model legislation by at least a decade. The other thing is you could have 2 bills that are identical except for like 5 energy resources being considered to be renewable in one state and not renewable in the other. And those 5 resources would make all the difference in terms of the operationalization of the law in that second state versus that first state. And so I want, and the cosine similarity score method wouldn't show that, because all it would show is like a 0.99 or whatever. And so what I wanted to do was capture that, I think, very important distinction that it can occur even in a world where 2 things might look identical. And there's several other hands. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who is...
Andy had his hand up first, and then we'll get to Christina. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Chinu. I had a question about the inability to code moderate legislation, which I think you had up one slide ago. So I don't know, there's so much research on dimensionality in political science, on ambivalence, and so many environmental policies have deeply ambivalent consequences on the environment. Fracking, organic food, there's never anything that is wholly good or wholly bad for the environment. They all have really, really complicated consequences. So I'm somewhat surprised to hear that it's difficult to code moderate policies and moderate consequences.
I will have to look into that. I know that Warsaw, and I forget how to pronounce the other person's name, they kind of have a policy liberalism scale. So that might be sort of an area that I could start with. But but I really haven't found sort of a qualitative area, and maybe I need to sort of talk with you and get some ideas on some of those dimensionality scales with respect to policy. But to find a policy area that would sort of fit that bill to complement, I think, what's been done on the conservative and the liberal side here.
All right, and then Christina, go ahead.
I just had one question regarding the time period for borrowing versus inventing. I'm wondering how you settled specifically on that 1 year and then 2 year period. Is there precedent in terms of other types of policy where those are the types of patterns we'd see? Or is there a reason to expect theoretically that that would be the relevant period of time?
Yeah, so game theoretic studies of diffusion, and there's a large literature, the two proponents of which I think are Steve Callender, who does a lot of work on sort of diffusion in federal systems and business organizations, and then Volden et al., and also some work in comparative, why am I forgetting his name? Kurt Wayland. So some work on diffusion suggests that there's boundedness to when members of a system are paying attention to what's going on across that system. And that boundedness, at least in the game theoretic work, is somewhere in the 1 to 2 year range, which is why I chose that window. That doesn't mean the window isn't wrong. There may be sort of ways to tease it out. As you can probably tell, as you widen that window further and further into the future, you're not studying invention anymore, you start studying adoption.
All right, does anyone have any, we have about a minute or two left, so if anyone has any last minute questions. All right. Well, we will finish this up, and I will have the recording of this, if you would like to share it, on our IBS website on the event page for this event. So feel free to check back there. And thank you so much. It was a very interesting talk. And Chinu, thank you very much.
And thanks to everyone for offering such great comments and questions and giving me your time. I very much appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.